All right, we are live.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome back to another episode of Emancipatory Education Now. My name is Vinson, and my pronouns are they and he, or just call me Vin, and I'm a second-year student majoring in business administration at San Jose State University and minoring in child and adolescent development. Joining me this evening are my lovely team of co-hosts, and I'll let them introduce themselves now.
Hi, my name is Annie. My pronouns are she, her, and I am graduating this semester from the counselor education program with a master's and a PPS credential.
Yay! I'm Leslye. I am a second-year doctoral student in educational leadership, and my pronouns are she and her.
My name is Gabi. My pronouns are she, her. I'm an undergraduate student. I'm a transfer student studying sociology.
Hello, I'm Jackie. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a graduating senior with the BA in Child and Adolescent Development with a community focus. And yeah.
Thank you for joining us tonight. A little background on Emancipatory Education Now. We are a student-led initiative at the Lurie College of Education at San Jose State University, where we critically evaluate systems and structures of oppression in our society, education systems, and advocate for the expansion of emancipatory education research, policies, and practices. Just a quick recap of what we've talked about so far. Our first episode, we had a Meet the Co-host episode. The second one, we had Gabi lead us in a discussion on ethnic studies. Leslye led us in our discussion on California Prop 16, and Annie led us on a discussion on cultures of power in the classroom. And Jackie just led us in a discussion last week on restorative approaches that decolonize education. This week, I'll be focusing on cultivating belonging and creating safe spaces. And next week, we'll be having, or in 2 weeks, we'll be having our wrap-up episode. For today's dialogue, we'll be exploring cultivating, belonging, and creating safe spaces. And this topic has been touched upon several times throughout our different episodes slightly, but I really wanted to dive deeper into this with a focus on how schools and communities specifically can help create those safe and supportive spaces for safe and supportive school environments with a focus on LGBTQ plus youth. And tonight we'll be watching a TEDx talk from Nate Monson, who is the executive director of Iowa Safe Schools. And in his talk, The Postmodern Queer Youth Experience, Nate emphasizes the need to implement safe zones to support queer youth. So we'll be watching that episode right now. Can everyone have?
What was that?
I don't see it, Vincent. You've kind of frozen.
Is different for every person. For me, it means a sense of my coming out and LGBT work to improve the lives of LGBTQ youth across.
I think we're having technical difficulties, so we're going to pause and try to get our video up and running.
Vincent, I have it queued up if you want me to share my screen.
Yeah, Gabi, can you do that?
Sure.
Thank you.
For sure. Brian, could you make me the co-host so I could do so?
All right, Gabi, you're all set.
Share computer. Yeah. Okay. Can you all see it?
Yep.
Okay.
The queer experience is different for every LGBTQ person. For me, it means a sense of mission and purpose. My coming out involved a lot of hurt, a lot of frustration, and at times loneliness. And that's the same for a lot of LGBTQ persons. For me, that translated into wanting to do work to improve the lives of LGBTQ youth across our state. And in 2007, I was able to start in a role that allowed me to do that. Now, during this time, from 2007 to today and on, we've seen a lot of advancements for LGBTQ equality. I've been able to see federal hate crimes law expand to allow gender identity, Don't Ask, Don't Tell repealed, employment protections here in Iowa, and of course, marriage equality. But what does this look like for queer youth in our state and across the country? We know that while these policies have changed, the experiences for queer youth are staying the same. So I looked up in statistics from 2007. The 2007 GLSEN National School Climate Survey, which surveyed LGBTQ youth, found that 60.8% of LGBTQ youth in this country felt unsafe in their school because of their sexual orientation. The most recent survey available, the 2015 National School Climate Survey, said 57.6% of LGBTQ youth felt unsafe at school because of their sexual orientation. During this time, the same statistic, 5 to 10 times more likely to attempt suicide than their heterosexual or cisgender peers. And 40% of all homeless youth in this country are LGBTQ. The stats simply aren't changing. Now, when I started in this role, there was this meeting, this big meeting I got to go to, one of the first ones, and I sat down and there was someone from a national organization showed up. It's a big deal when you work for a state group and national comes to town. So there's national, there's all of us LGBTQ leaders, and they had this big whiteboard, and they had us list out the priorities of our community. Employment protections, Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal, and marriage was at the front and center of it. And I, like everyone else in the room in 2007 at the time, laughed it off. Marriage, that's never gonna happen, that's 50 years from now, no one likes us, oh, it's gonna be forever, right? Well, prove me wrong, 2 years later, Iowa became the 3rd state in the country for marriage equality, and in 2015, the US Supreme Court ruled in favor. And that was a big achievement. And marriage is a big deal, it really is. It means you can make healthcare decisions for your partner. It means if one spouse is an immigrant, they're able to advance quicker on citizenship without fear of deportation. But I would argue something is just as important. It's the issues impacting queer youth. So back at that meeting, I kept raising my hand and going, hey, hi, yes, I think we should be talking about conversion therapy. It's this practice that impacts 1 in 3 LGBTQ persons. It's this idea you can change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity through therapy or abuse. We should be talking about that. Hey, what about those homeless youth? Hi, what about GSAs, supporting gay straight alliances in our schools? That makes a big impact for youth. And I was told by that national organizer, do youth donate and do they vote? Because we're going to prioritize now. So while I've watched marriage campaigns happen, come and go, I've seen hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars spent towards pro-LGBTQ equality, focusing on adults. And at that same time, I get to work with kids. One story in particular, a 15-year-old gay student who was outed at his school. He was outed, no fault of his own. School calls, what do? We don't want to get sued, big deal. And then we figured out, okay, we can get the student maybe to go stay at a friend's that place that night, and made those adjustments and tried to figure out what else we can do to help support the student. I call a couple days later to check on that student. How is he doing? How are things going? Well, he went back to his parents' house and they sent him away. What do you mean they sent him away? They sent him away. No one else was asking, what happened to that kid? Is he okay? Did he make it where he was going okay? Is he on the streets? he just vanished. And everyone at that school and town just acted like he never existed. A couple years later, there was a student, a teenager, killed here in Northeast Iowa. He was beat to death, a youth of color. When he was beat to death, his killers kept saying the word faggot to him over and over again. That was some of the last words he heard. And I remember calling news reporters, calling these national organizations, hey, you got a lot of money. We could probably do a campaign ad on this. This is a big deal. We can make some change happen. That's nice. Got a little blurb in the Advocate. Nothing else. Then, in 2016, we had a student in Southeast Iowa, a gender-fluid youth who was walking home, picked up by two individuals, and was taken back to their place, tortured, and murdered, and left in an alley. 2016 this happened. Hey, we should be talking about this. They killed this kid because of their gender identity. We should be adding this to the state's hate crimes law. We should be making this a big deal. Why aren't we out there with pitchforks trying to find the killers and change things? Got a little blurb, just ignored. And then just this week, I talked to a GSA president, and he had found out 2 weeks ago there was a student at his school that completed suicide. And that was after they came out to their parents and they had been rejected. So for that queer youth experience, we're not seeing the change happen. If you can get to the age of 18, you have a lot of rights, liberties, and freedoms. But for our youth, they're not there yet. We haven't put our money where our mouth is on that. And so what we've seen, though, is for millennials, it's a changing world. 50% of millennials believe that gender and sexuality are fluid. We're also seeing youth come out younger and younger. I just got to work with a bunch of fifth graders, who got to pick a class project. You know what they got to pick? LGBTQ rights. They're going to hang a pride flag at their elementary school in the gym. And they're doing that because they have bisexual and transgender peers. And I think that's pretty cool and gives me a lot of hope. But what we know is we have a lot more work to do to support our LGBTQ youth in their schools. For one, we gotta have a conversation amongst us as a queer family. Fam, I gotta talk to Fam for a second here. Hi, girl. Hey, girl. Hey. Yeah, we gotta have a chat. Because I know there's resources available. I know we can make a difference for LGBTQ youth, and we gotta be supporting our own. I need you to be donating to those GSAs, your LGBTQ youth groups, homeless shelters, mental health facilities, whatever you can do to make a difference. I know the resources are there, and we have to stop talking about wedding cakes and wedding cake bakers. I'm done with it because we got kids that are in crisis. So fam, get it together. We can do this for our little village, because it takes a village to raise a kid. And that means our schools, our mental health providers, faith communities, educators, all those folks in those helping professions. I need your help. First off, if you have any prejudice in your heart, helping professions probably aren't for you. Sorry to say, you should probably go into another career. And if you do have a full heart that wants to and believes in these kids and wants to help them out, then we need to be giving you the tools and resources and know how to do that. That means understanding transgender students and their rights, using the right pronouns, using the right name, helping them change forms, helping them support a gay-straight alliance at their school. Because when you do these things, shocking, I know, but those statistics that I mentioned, they go down in those schools that do that. Students are more likely to feel safe. They're less likely to have suicidal risks if you support them. Isn't that a novel idea? When you support a human being, they are more whole and they're less likely to experience bad things. Finally, for our parents and our family out there with LGBTQ youth, you got a special place in my heart. And especially the parents of trans kids. I understand that there is a mourning period that takes place when your child comes out as transgender. You mourn the loss of a son or a daughter. But I need you to get it together a little bit faster. Because every day that you're mourning that loss, Your son or daughter is getting more distant from you now. You got to get it together. You got 3 jobs as a parent. 1, you got to love your kid. 2, you better be their champion. And 3, you better protect them. That's your jobs. And you've got to be there for them. And as parents, you've got to ask questions. You've got to go get support if you need it, whatever you can do, but you've got to get to a place of love a lot faster. Because we're losing too many students to suicide and bullying and rejection. It's happening far too often. If we can do these things, we can create these safe spaces. But it takes each and every one of us to be involved and active. We should be asking questions. We should be giving tools and resources to those in those helping professions. We should be empowering parents. And we need to empower our gay straight alliances, our GSAs, our student organizations on campuses. Whatever we can do to let people be their full self. And it will happen. There's a quote about we will be citizens when you talk about LGBTQ rights. And we're seeing that. We will be citizens. That time will come when we're no longer in the shadows, we're not dying silent deaths anymore. We're there. But when we hear those stories, we need to share it. We need people to be aware. We need to empower folks. We need to help our youth. Thank you.
That was a really awesome video. So some things that I really wanted to highlight again from the video is that Vinson mentioned that we've seen a lot of advancements for LGBTQ plus equality. Federal hate crime laws expanded to protect gender identity. Don't ask, don't tell was repealed, marriage equality, and earlier this year in 2020, employment protections at the federal level as well. But while we've seen these policy advancements at the federal, state, and local levels across the country, the experiences for queer youth are still pretty much the same. And I was kind of curious about the Leslye National School Survey climate data. So then I looked up the data for 2019 because they have these different reports every different year. So the numbers for 2019 is that 59.1% of LGBTQ plus students felt unsafe at schools because of their gender, because of their sexual orientation, and 42.5% because of their gender expression, and 37.4% because of their gender. Compared to the numbers that Vinson mentioned in the talk in 2007, which is 60.8% of students feeling unsafe because of their sexual orientation, and then in 2019, 59.1%, that's not much of a difference either. So the numbers haven't really changed in the last decade or so. So that was something I really wanted to highlight from the video. And what else stood out to y'all from the video? Was there anything that you thought was interesting that Vinson highlighted?
One thing that stood out to me was just that I think a lot of times the talk has been about marriage equality when we talk about LGBTQ rights, but marriage equality, while it is really important, is not the only thing that impacts the everyday lives of queer people and LGBTQ people. So I thought that it was interesting that he was really the only one that was advocating for queer youth when he was with a bunch of organizers. And I do think the work he's doing is very important, like housing programs, because like you mentioned, like LGBTQ people are affected by issues like housing, mental health, among other things. So that was what stood out to me.
For me, it was the very specific narratives that some of teenagers or like the adolescents experience who were queer, and just how violent they got, and you know, they unfortunately lost their lives because of someone's, I don't even know what to call it. It doesn't feel right to call belief system, because you're like
Ignorance.
Yes. And it's really frustrating just to see like how, yes, there has been a really great political like forwardness when it comes to like laws and like marriage equality. But like, what does that look like when it comes into the schools? Like, what does that look like in the cultures? Like, I really liked when he mentioned talking about like the fifth graders, like already taking pride and like already making like that inclusive space because they're aware of who their peers are. And it's like, it's never too early to introduce this to people, to like children, you know? And the more we start talking about it, like the more comfortable it is for everybody.
I'm just, I think I continue to be alarmed by how much progress has been made. And while we may feel like that progress is substantial, that it doesn't necessarily translate into changes in the day-to-day life environments of LGBTQ youth or people in general that are within the LGBTQ community. And even when we think about something like this video, you know, one of the things that I thought about was his ability as a, I mean, I believe he's like white identified male, to speak to these issues in a way that would be more likely to be received than someone who, for example, is trans identified or that has other like layers of identity. What's the word I want to use? I'm basically saying that he has some identity privileges, perhaps, in his ability to deliver this information. And so when we think about queer youth, right, in what ways might their class status, their socioeconomic status of their family, their and other layers of their identity further exacerbate issues that they face being identified as lesbian, gay, or trans in a school environment. And a friend of mine had mentioned recently a story about how they were basically trying to figure out how to integrate a trans youth into the school. And they gave the example of like the youth had to go to the nurse's office to change for PE. And my response to that was, why didn't the children who were uncomfortable with the trans kid have to go to the nurse's office for PE? You know, that we shouldn't be making these kids further ostracize themselves and treat their bodies, you know, differently as something that we should not be exposed to. And so I liked much of the call to action points that were mentioned in the video. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about that more, but I was both inspired and still feeling like we have so far to go.
Yeah, Leslye, I really love what you said about essentially like the intersection of identities, because pretty much like any, you know, large group of people who share perhaps one trait, there's like so much variety among the experiences of LGBTQ youth, and that has a lot to do with, you know, how they identify, I think, and any like intersectional identities that they also possess or identify with, and having like recognition, understanding, and representation of the wide variety of experiences, I think would just go such a long way to influencing the culture and making you know, both LGBTQ youth and people who aspire to be allies just like more informed and more able to just like feel like, you know, things are normal and don't need to be otherized and don't need to be ostracized, or don't need to like have perpetual ignorance about some of these experiences.
Yeah, and that really ties back to Jackie's point that in the video that Monson mentioned that, you know, the fifth graders, they had that opportunity to do that school project on LGBTQ rights. And not all students have that, you know, opportunity at every school across the US, because some different locations in the US, like some schools are more accepting and some schools are more, you know, not as understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, personally, I just think representation is such an issue in terms of like LGBTQ plus representation. It's something that I'm very personally invested in for like personal reasons, and it's an issue across the board. I think, you know, we've discussed this in like a variety of contexts, how important representation is, and I think this is just another one of them, and it's like significantly influenced my life personally. And you know, I just think that like the representation of different stories, different experiences needs to be given so much more consideration, like in society and media in general, but also specifically in classrooms, because that's where it's going to impact and make a difference to kiddos.
Yeah, I agree, Annie. Representation makes a big difference. And kind of what you said, Leslye, about like his positionality, you know, he's white passing, you know, and like how different would the TED Talk have been if they were trans or, you know, a person of color or whatever different stories or narratives that we all have as individuals. Like, and yeah, like with that, like it's also really using it as your strength, like being able to use your identity as a strength to like communicate and just, you know, keep fighting for that inclusivity. And yeah, it's going to be easier for other people to do it, and that's kind of where I feel the responsibility falls more on, like for the people who it's easier to do. Because I've heard really terrible stories, like, you know, not just the ones that he mentioned in the TED Talk, but like for queer youth, you know, and it's really sad, and it shouldn't be experienced, and sadly it is. And, you know, we see all these kids committing suicide, and it's really sad. And I wish we could do more. Like have this talk. I know it's definitely a stepping stone. It's definitely a step in the right direction, but
Yeah, and you know, Jackie, you bringing up that point kind of reminds me of a study that I read somewhere. I believe it was in 2019, the Trevor Project released that if an LGBTQ youth had at least one supportive adult in their life that understood, you know, their identity and who they are and accepted them, then their suicide risk would be reduced by 40%, which is a pretty powerful number. Yeah.
I know. I think what you're saying also makes me think how I want all teachers not like to be allies, even if they're not LGBTQ, because a lot of times kids are kind of testing where they're like, they won't explicitly come out, but they'll mention something, kind of broach the topic, where they might show you a YouTube video and you're like, oh, I understand what's going on here. Like I had a fourth grader, he was like, look at my favorite YouTube person. And I'm like, oh, they're really cool. Like I really like them too. So just kind of like supporting them and like encouraging them that way. And I think I feel like that happens for all queer people, where like before you really come out or before you really come to terms with it, you're very sensitive to the reactions of other people around you. So if people say something that they might not even think is offensive, but is derogatory or implies something, then it can be really detrimental. So I think like representation is so important, and also just like competency around being an LGBTQ educator.
Yeah, and do you all think that educators are prepared to like make their classrooms more inclusive? Like, do we equip them with like the necessary skills and knowledge and resources to, you know, support their students?
I mean, I think I don't know. I would probably guess that it depends on location and on the goals of that particular district. I don't see it being something that I would hear as regularly integrated in regards to how often we hear about hate crimes and attacks on people from the community, right? So I get the sense at least that we still are not where we should be, but I also am cautious about the idea that training is the solution. We've had several topics, discussions on this show together. And oftentimes it's about equipping people with knowledge and tools. And while that is valuable and beneficial, I don't think that that is solving homophobia. I don't think that that is solving and resolving transphobia, right? And as long as those things are supported nationally and internationally, that is, our negative attitudes towards groups of people that are not cisgender or people who are not heterosexual, then we'll continue to see the emergence of not only people in general, but also schools that are not inviting to students who are different. And so, so with that said, yeah, we can have a training, but it requires much more thoroughness and thought. And we saw that come up with the, the bathroom bills that were coming up in North Carolina and other places, right? Like direct attacks on humanity, direct attacks on and willful ignorance around everyone's need to use a bathroom, and so we can't even get to that basic level of like all humans are humans and therefore deserve, then it's like, then why even have a training, right? Like if we can't get at that baseline foundational agreement, then, what are we doing? And so, and I often think that those types of approaches protect the very people that have helped to maintain the status quo. And we create these trainings of comfort, really, for them to, tiptoe their way through what they don't know, while the marginalized are on the other side having to continue doing this education. So, so I guess you hear me saying I'm not for training, only in the sense that I think it structurally is part of the laziness that contributes to hostile environments for LGBTQ people.
Leslye, I like what you said about like the knowledge and tools that are like supposed to like equip people or like educators. I had a group project this semester on, we had to pick a chapter, and my group chose one on culture and gender. And even like in the beginning of the semester, the professor was saying how who creates these books, they're very Eurocentric. And you could just tell because like there was so much I wanted to draw on, but we couldn't based on the book. And I called it out. I'm like, okay, the book doesn't do a good job talking about this, about gender. Like, so we like chose to expand it. And we used this visual called the gingerbread, but genderbread person. It was really cute. Like it's super understandable. And going back to the bathroom thing, like it's been really cool to see like public spaces that do try to do like gender neutral bathrooms. Like I went to a restaurant recently and I saw that and I was like, oh wow, like okay. Like I didn't expect that to see that here in like Minnesota. I was like, okay, like, it's a very small step, but it makes a difference for someone who has a challenge in those situations. And like I feel like that's where people who are cisgender like have that privilege because they don't have that experience. They don't have those situations where they have to like compromise who they are and compromise their identity. And this is me saying it as an adult, like what if it's like a teen and they're by themselves? I remember working as a server and like I saw this person with a short haircut and I was like, oh, I really like your hair. And I could tell they weren't used to that kind of reaction because I heard them tell the person that they were in the bathroom with, like, oh, they said something about my hair. And I'm like, wow, like a compliment goes a long way. Like people, it's just like a really nice reminder that like you're seen, you're valid, like your experience matters. And for that to happen in classrooms, like it's not, I don't think training is enough. It's really just going back to like what Annie talked about, it's like the culture of power, just like what kind of cultures does a school create? Like what kind of power do teachers have to create that inclusivity in their classrooms? And then the whole thing with bullying, like that's like the most upsetting thing about like the whole queer youth experience. You know, that's part of the reason why I didn't become comfortable with my identity until I was a grown ass person, like 2 years ago, you know? So I can't help but imagine or like think about like how my experience would have been different if there was inclusive spaces or where I felt comfortable or where there was information being offered and shared and, you know, spaces that made me feel that I could talk about this and not be judged.
I agree. I think like we see the whole thing with diversity, like a lot of companies are trying to just do diversity trainings and call it a day. So I don't think training's enough, but I think it would be so cool if it was incorporated into the education of the teachers where when they're learning to become a teacher, they learn how to become competent with different identities, including LGBTQ identities. And I don't know, I guess I also wonder, because I think you have a lot of older teachers too. Like I wonder what is the best way to make the school, because you do have some teachers that are like 50 and 60 and it's new concepts for them that they haven't really considered. And just the way that a school functions is that you're not going to be able to just, you know what I mean? Just, I don't want to say get rid of them, but yeah, I'm like, yeah.
I mean, the concept, the names and things might have been different, but I don't think they're, at least, I mean, like talking to my mom, like certainly there were gay people when she was in high school, right? And so, and thinking about, I think the one thing that makes us maybe perhaps more familiar with it is more people feeling free enough, safe enough to share their coming out story. But I recently saw something that talked about how heterosexual people should be coming out, right?
Yeah.
We shouldn't assume that, you know, only,
Clear.
yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
So, and I thought that was interesting because, again, as Jackie said, there's a privilege to, you know, being in a body that you feel comfortable in and being in, readily being in a room where other people share those similarities to you. And I think that that we have a duty, those of us who have, you know, gender and sexuality privilege have a duty to ensure that the space is welcoming for everyone.
Mhm.
Talk about the training for students also makes me think of like sex education that goes on at the 5th grade level and the 8th grade level. And like we were talking about ethnic studies, and I just think it'd be cool if there were LGBTQ studies too. Because like Jackie or someone else said, it's never too young for kids to start learning. And I think that does help them be more inclusive.
Mhm.
Sorry, Annie, what were you going to say?
Oh no, I totally agree with that, Gabi. And furthermore, I think sex education should be expanded to include sex education for LGBTQ youth, because I'm thinking back to the sex education I received, which was actually a fairly, as far as I can tell, like fairly liberal version of sex education. And yet there was absolutely nothing that would serve LGBTQ youth in there, like help them understand about their own bodies, or, you know, different forms of experiences, or like, you know, how to have sex, like, you know, which there was a visual representation of that for heterosexual sex. And so I think that would be a huge thing. I also had like a question. There's always more to be said, but I did want to throw out a question because Leslye, what you were saying made me think about how, like, yes, it is really important for you know, spaces to be safe and welcoming, and it made me think about, you know, the teachers who or, you know, staff members who work with kids who are perhaps LGBTQ plus or like have an identity, and it's also important for them to feel safe enough to express that. And then that will therefore impact the kids, I think, as well. Like, oh, my teacher is gay. Like, clearly being gay is normal, for example. And, in some cases, I think that really depending on the culture of the school and the district, like, the teachers or the adults may not feel comfortable with that either. And then clearly the kids will not feel comfortable with it. So what do you think can be, I guess, done to promote a culture of comfort for kids and for adults to feel comfortable and safe expressing themselves openly?
Yeah, I love that idea, Annie, that you mentioned. And it reminded me as you were talking, I recently saw on social media a person posting about how they were pissed. Their kid came home from COVID school in tears, that they had an assignment to share the story of their parents, and that the teacher insisted mom and dad, mom and dad, mom and dad. And the child is like, I have two moms, right? And the teacher is like engaging in this argument with the kid. And I can see everyone is like, right? I mean, like, I'm getting infuriated just as I'm describing it, and it's like, maybe it was totally harmful initially, the activity of like come up with your parent story or whatever. But to defend against or push against the child's response to the assignment with this like heteronormative, no, it must be this way kind of thing is furthering the harm, right? And now the parent has to go up there and advocate for their kid about something that should be so obvious to another adult, to say, okay, you have two moms. Okay, so if you have two moms, write about your two moms, right?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to share that. But Vincent, I'm sorry, I think I cut you off.
No, that's all right. Thank you for sharing that. That's really important to, hear. Like, yeah, like sometimes like it's in lesson planning that, teachers quote unquote assume that this is the thing that everyone follows, but like not everyone is cis or, straight. And like even adding on to Annie's point, where I remembered a story on like, just thinking about staff members, and if they like don't feel like they're included enough at a school, how can they share themselves? Like last year, a non-binary teacher in California was trying to explain the gender unicorn, and they were actually disciplined for it because they were sharing the gender unicorn and trying to like, educate the students on gender.
I think to kind of say more about what Leslye shared and to answer your question, Annie, there's just like that disconnection that really just shown, like was highlighted through that. And it really comes down to like word choice, like how different would the project have been? It's like, oh, like talk about like the adults in your life, or like talk about the people who love you, or talk about like your caregivers, or like something that's even more inclusive, because like some people don't even have moms or dads. They have like grandparents caring for them, or their foster youth, or whatever their backstory is. And yes, Vinson, lesson plans, like those go a long way. And it sucks to hear that they were disciplined for that, but I mean, their intentions were good. I don't know, they still got information, which is good, but I wish that he wasn't like reprimanded, and there should be more like lesson plans that do that. I was gonna say something. I'll go back. I'll bring it back.
Well, one thing that I think you're all highlighting super well is how it's so important that we just consider every little thing we say, and how, when you are privileged in the sense of being heterosexual or cisgender, like it's easy to be completely blind to like how every little word can have a microaggressive or hidden meaning, saying like, tell me about your mom and dad, or even the kind of pronouns you use, the kinds of ways you describe things. Like, it's very easy to reorient your language to be like very inclusive, but I think it's something we need to like be conscious and deliberate about. And also, I just want to echo what was said earlier for everybody, that like for the people who are in privileged positions, when stuff like that happens, when like a kid is told that they don't know who their parents are, or like, a teacher just like sharing information about like gender becomes discipline, like that the people who do have the privilege do speak out and stand up in those situations for inclusivity as well.
Yes, Annie. When I worked with kids, I was trying to really be more inclusive. So I worked with first graders and I found myself saying boys and girls all the time. So I had to train myself. I was like students, and we had like our first graders, and it was really hard because it's so ingrained in us to see like boys and girls, that group of boys over there, come over here. And I was like, wow, like I don't know. I just realized how it starts so young. And yeah, I don't know. So it's just like monitoring that language, and then also just trying to be more inclusive, like what Jackie's saying about everyone's different family situations. Not everyone has a mom and a dad. And it can be very uncomfortable for kids to feel like they have to bring that up. Like for Mother's Day, there were a few kids in our class that don't have mothers. And I think there's just a way to frame it to be more inclusive. So I think, like Vincent, you're saying with the lesson plans, it's so true. There are like little tweaks that you can make for lesson plans, especially for the traditional holidays or the events that happen every year, to include everyone.
Yeah, that's what sorry. What were you gonna say?
Oh, you can go first, Jackie.
Okay. That reminded me of what I was gonna say earlier. When Leslye, you were saying you had something about like, oh, like how would LGBTQ like history be incorporated into lesson plans and stuff, and that like took my mind to thinking about how there's so many great people in our history that aren't talked about because of their identity, or like their identity isn't highlighted. Talking about the Stonewall riots in New York, it took me a really long time to even know, Sylvia, and I forget the other names, but I think it's just kind of like, it's not that you necessarily have to like, make a big showcase, like, these are all the gay people, but it's really like the way you talk about them, and just like, that it's the way you talk about people. It's like building the inclusivity.
Yeah, and going back to the point someone said about, using gender inclusive language, some language that you can incorporate into your vocabulary is, instead of saying hey guys, like say y'all or folk or beautiful people, scholars, everyone, students, class, team, like, or family. Like, it makes you feel like a sense of community, and that way everyone is included. And of course, this conversation can go on a lot longer, and there's so many different issues and so many different things we can talk about. But we want to close this out with some call to actions. And for SJSU students, faculty, and staff, there is a Belong at SJSU Campus Climate Survey debrief or town hall happening next week on Thursday and Friday that you should definitely check out to learn more about the campus climate and what we can do as an SJSU community to make our campus more inclusive. And also, you can also add your, for SJSU students, you can add your pronouns to your My SJSU account as of today, which is a really big step forward, and I'm really excited about. Yeah, so you can go into your My SJSU and modify that and add that. For staff members, if you have an opportunity to use your staff development resources, you can also like attend conferences or professional development opportunities to learn more about different identities and how to advocate and listen to your this. So the Solidarity Network, they do a lot of work on social justice and identity building. So if you're interested, they're hosting a social justice retreat called Leadership Today, and that's hosted by Mosaics and several other different campus partners as well, which focuses on diversity, social justice, and cross-cultural communication. Applications are due November 9th. And also just for everyone, introduce yourself by your common name. Like, like whenever you're meeting someone, you can just be like, hey, this is my name, this is what I go by, and these are my pronouns. And that just makes, everything more inclusive. And then that way you're not making any assumptions about anyone's gender identity. And you're also respecting a person's pronouns. And also take time to educate yourself and listen to other people and their stories and experiences. There's also this really cool book podcast series hosted by Lurie College alum, the Book Boat podcast. You should check that out as well. They feature all sorts of different books about, like with different types of representation, because sometimes like it's hard to find, these different stories. So that's really awesome. And I'm going to check that podcast out as well. And take care of your all well-being. And it takes everyone to make a difference. So definitely get out there and vote if you haven't already. Hope you have a great